Good morning, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for waiting. I'm terribly sorry that we are late, but I think it was a worthwhile exchange. So I'm Sabine Al-Khair. I direct Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, which co-hosts this seminar of Professor Sen with the Moral Philosophy Seminar led by Professor Jeff McMahon, the White Professor of Moral Philosophy here. And we are absolutely delighted that you have come to the seminar or that you are watching it online. And to the community gathered here, Professor Sen needs no introduction, and although I would dearly like to, I think you've been very patient in waiting, and so rather than doing it, I'm sure that you would prefer to have an interchange with Professor Sen. But we are all aware very much of the academic publications and their distinction in spanning ethics and economics, in spanning both formal and conceptual treatments of different topics, and of the great range of intersection that he has and that these writings presently have with newer contributions in social choice theory and related literatures. And the bibliography to the book Collective Choice in Social Welfare spans the 75 of the 600 pages. So it's very exciting and humbling, I think, for all of us to have you here, Amartya. We're all most grateful because not only do you offer this occasion for academic exchange on a very busy day, in which you're also giving a Sheldonian lecture on democracy and social decisions at the very point that democracy and those institutions are at a crisis point. And you're also very generous to give your time at a week when you have so many other engagements in London, speaking and with the media. So we're very, very grateful for this exchange and looking forward to it. So the format of this seminar is as follows. Amartya will open the proceedings with an informal introduction to collective choice and social welfare, following which we will invite him to respond to interventions on 3 topics. And then I will turn the chair over to Jeff McMahon, who will recognize additional questions from the floor. And as ever, we would prefer that your interventions be concise and that persons rather than mobile phones contribute to the discussion. And we should really have quite a rich exchange on the topics covered in the book. And I should also mention that those who sought to attend this event would have filled more than 2 theaters of this size. And so it has also been live streamed, as you have seen by the notices posted. And I do apologize, but at the close of the event, we cannot offer any book signing because Amartya has really a very packed schedule indeed. But we think that the most important is the academic exchange that follows. So thank you so very much. Amartya.
Thank you. Question. There's no way of increasing the light in the
We will look into it and attempt to do so.
It's the illusion of indulging in soliloquy. Disturbing. The second question is probably, I know the answer. There isn't behind that beautiful picture, there isn't a blackboard, is there?
I'm afraid there's not.
No. Okay.
I wish there were. With
Okay.
chalk as well, I'm supposed to.
Yeah, no, I was going to do a table, but I don't think that I could. But actually, I guess people are equipped to imagine a table. Well, I would have said it's very nice to see so many old friends here, but I don't see who are here. But it's very nice to be back at Oxford. And thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Sabina, for arranging all this. I think it should be mostly Q&A, but let me say a few words. And I'm looking forward, of course, to Jeff McMahon's presentation. I mean, the social choice theory is a kind of old subject that has figured in one way or another in most societies, whether you think of Japanese discussion in the 6th century about the Constitution of 17 articles, or Ashoka's statement about public decisions and people's views in 3rd century BC India. There's a long, long history of people worried about it, but it is the French Revolution and the European Enlightenment that brought the subject to its present form, aided particularly by French mathematicians such as Marquis de Condorcet and Borda and others. And some of them, Condorcet in particular, has this kind of dual role of being on one side concerned with the mathematics of aggregation, including voting decisions, in which Borda was, of course, also involved. But Condorcet was also one of the theorists of the French Revolution, and his work carries imprint of both these. On one side, the institutional complexities of aggregation, in which things like the voting paradox, X defeating Y, Y defeating Z, Z defeating X, figure, and also, along with that, his concern with how society should go about making these decisions, and his focus on the importance of public reasoning and public discussion in this context. It turns out that the kind of response that came to those early French mathematical works were quite comprehensively transformed into modern social choice theory by Kenneth Arrow around 1950. His book came out in 51. 50 was a great paper. But he was concerned, and this is important to recognize in the context of the present book, is that he was concerned with one aspect of Condorcet, namely the voting paradox aspect, and not so much the public reasoning aspect. The voting paradox thing had been followed by many people in between, including in this city by Reverend Dodson, more well known as Lewis Carroll, in his writings about voting. But that was also particularly concerned with Dodson's interest in keeping Max Miller out of the college governing body, so that there was a kind of immediate purpose to his propositions. The follow-up of the discussion on the public reasoning side was also phenomenal. I would say the biggest contributor there was probably John Stuart Mill, though in different ways Karl Marx could also be seen as an inheritor of that. And of course, at that time of Condorcet, and much of an influence on Condorcet was Adam Smith, who did discuss the need for public reasoning and I think the device of the impartial spectator was brought in as a particular way of aiding public discussion in terms of seeing ethical positions, political propositions as ultimately having cognitive aspects. The last few weeks have been tragic weeks for me because I lost two great friends and big influences on my own thinking, but much more importantly, very close friend. One of them was Tony Atkinson, whom I've just, we got to mainly delayed because I went to see Tony's widow there, and Judith. But there was also Derek Parfit, who had a big influence on my thinking, and indeed in my moving to Oxford in 1970s. his work on what matters, that feature of the role of reason. I mean, he was concerned with issues of meta-ethics, really, about the content of ethical statements and the foundations of them, in a way that the social choice theory wasn't. And I don't think it could be said that Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill wasn't. Adam Smith came somewhat close to that perspective in some of his writings, and particularly his earliest in the theory of moral sentiment. I think the book that I wrote and published in 1970, which represented my work in the 1960s, mostly at the Delhi School of Economics, where I was then teaching, and I was blessed with having extraordinary students. That was very much influenced by the Arrow voting aspect, the Condorcet, that aspect of his work. And I may say a couple of things on that, but I also say that the second book is much more, I was going to use the word informed, but that seems like a bit arrogant to say, but certainly much more influenced by the role of reasoning and public reasoning in particular in understanding what's going on in social choice. In the first book, I sometimes think that it's a good way of thinking about these issues that Marx was particularly keen on, namely, what exactly are you denying, which is a kind of dialectical way of thinking about it. I was denying that the Arrow impossibility theorem showed that there was something basically wrong with democracy. To me, it looked like that it's something to think about in order to decide what form democracy should take. I was concerned also with the idea, and I think there's a slight bit of excessive identification, if not confounding, between the problem that arises when you're taking a public decision, like a voting rule, like whether Britain should leave Europe or not, and social justice issues in which people like Tony Atkinson was particularly interested. Because if they're doing the latter, then there's no way of operating in a model in which interpersonal comparison is ruled out. Now, it's kind of difficult now to think the kind of atmosphere in which I was growing up as a student more than 60 years ago, 65 years ago, in which it was generally thought that interpersonal comparison had something illegitimate about it. A proposition that you cannot get a kind of empirical verification, which also I think is false, of it is economists taken very seriously, and unlike, I mean, it was strongly influenced by logical positivists, I think, but unlike A.J. Ayer, who, when being interviewed in the BBC, when he asked why is it that he doesn't like his book, Language, Truth and Logic, is that, well, the main reason is because what I said was mostly wrong. Now that, I don't think that a kind of classic denial the economists never pursued. Once they got hold of that point, they were not going to go to any other point from there. But Ken Arrow, unfortunately, was victim of that too. But you couldn't do social justice or anything like that without interpersonal comparison. Paolo Buffy, who was a banker in the Bank of England, later governor of the bank, and I gave the first Buffy lecture, and I went through some of his papers. It's interesting that he was discussing as a student at LSE that he found it very peculiar that there was all these people, so much misery going on all around in the 1930s, And people were wondering whether it is possible to say that some people are more miserable than others, because he saw these very miserable people all around, clearly much more miserable than many others he knew. And so that's there's an interesting history of philosophical thought to be written as to how it could have seemed plausible. Anyway, the fact of the matter is, you bring in interpersonal comparison, the arrow theorem disappears, and then you can get more into it. Actually, even comparison of levels, you get there. But as I think Kevin Roberts showed, that comparison of levels still confine you to a very small class of social choice rules. And if you can make bigger things like compare differences and differences of differences and so on, and go towards cardinal utility, then you can get more and more opened up opportunities of dealing with social justice issues. I was also concerned that there was a complete neglect of the idea of rights, which was already quite big then, but it's become much bigger now, of course, with the literature on human rights. But I was writing not long after under Eleanor Roosevelt's leadership, the United Nations passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it seemed peculiar that social choice theories couldn't deal with that, so I brought that in and found an immediate difficulty in there being a contradiction, because once you take that seriously, you may have to deny some of the very sacred principles, like the Pareto principle in social choice theory. That's the kind of material the 1970 book was concerned with. It didn't go in, I did begin with public reasoning, and I ended with public reasoning, but I didn't go into it in any serious way. And I knew that then that was a defect. I have to deal with it sometime, and I tried to go into it later. One of the definitive moments for that was when I was writing the introduction to the 250th anniversary of Theory of Moral Sentiments of Smith, which came out as the Penguin anniversary edition of the Moral Sentiment. And it was quite clear how the problem was clear to many people. This is the peculiar role of Smith, who influenced people like Condorcet, who founded social choice theory, rather than himself doing anything as formal as social choice theory. But I think that distinction between formality and informality I've always thought to be a relatively trivial distinction, and that, I'm afraid, applies here too. But there was a great deal that Condorcet got from Smith, which is actually part of his pronouncement, particularly in Esquisse, on how to think about social choice. So that is what the book in the present form tends to expand a bit. It also does more on interpersonal comparison. I'd done something about partial comparability and so on, so it could pursue that idea. But then there is the whole issue of public reasoning coming up, and it's a big issue, and it's amazing to me how Mill's point that democracy is governed by discussion, not his own phrase. The phrase, I think, came from Bagehot, but it's his idea, and Bagehot actually gives credit to Mill on that. But somehow I'm amazed, for example, in this country, when I was present here in June, when the Brexit vote took place, and there's a narrow victory on one side, it was a terrible discussion when there were a lot of lies uttered, including the idea that huge sum of money will come in from not having to pay the euro dues, and those will go straight into National Health Service, a statement that was withdrawn 2 days after the referendum. But by then the referendum has already taken place, and no one seemed to think that it made a difference as to what the quality of epistemology was behind that ethical decision or political decision that was being taken. I was surprised that this territory was never revisited. Somehow it was taken as Prime Minister May put it yesterday, when Britain decided to leave Europe. These are big statements. social decision, and that's going to be my subject of my talk at the Sheldonian tonight. To say that narrow vote on a very imperfect epistemic debate somehow can be seen as Britain decided, which is a very big social choice claim, seems to have a level of frivolity in it, which I'm surprised hasn't come out. People, maybe they're Remainers and they're Leavers, and this morning, having read The Guardian, I now know disgruntled Leavers as a further category to be included in that. But it's not one who thought that this whole exercise wasn't about what Britain decided. There was a rule presented by the ruler by the leader of one of the parties to deal with a party disaffection about polling, and the Prime Minister makes a statement. The Prime Minister making a statement that we will do what the polls Brexit vote will tell us. That doesn't get translated into that Brexit or victory would mean that Britain has decided. There's also a view of public reasoning which central to social choice theory, which is not that there are things like periodic elections, and when there's elections, something happens, and then between that, for 4 years in Britain, or for 5 years in India, social choice doesn't exist. That's already been made. It's a discontinuous process, and in which there's occasional votes, and when the votes happen, social choice comes in, and then it goes until 4 years or 5 years afterwards. Whereas the view that Mill was arguing, and is probably best discussed in what I think is Mill's third great book. I think of on liberty and the subjection of women to be his greater works, but representative government is just full of why you need a representative government to continue this debate. So much so that it even tempts Mill to think whether educated people should have more vote or not. It's a non-Millian thought that Mill entertains, but concerned with trying to raise the epistemic quality of public discussion, which he thinks is central of social choice. That, I'm afraid, is an aspect that the European discipline of social choice theory tended to neglect, and I wanted to go against that. I was just amazed when I was writing this book. It originally began because I was teaching courses in social choice theory, initially with Robert Nozick, then with Eric Maskin, and for a year with Tony Atkinson when he visited. And Eric Maskin and I still continue to teach that every second year. We teach something every year together, but it varies, and every second year it's social choice theory. And it's amazing how that perspective didn't get much airing at all in the huge social choice literature. When I was going through it, I thought that it's endless. It's this it's a variant of one of the statements that attributed to Hilary Putnam, referring to a philosopher whom I would not name, whom he did not like, saying that whether you have asking people whether you have heard of the new proof that that philosopher has infinitely many papers. And the proof consists of saying that to every paper of his that you read, there is another which is even worse. And so here I seem to find to every paper there is yet another which is even more complex, without addressing many of the central issues. But it is a rich literature. There's a lot of insight. It was fun for me to revisit my childhood passion with this kind of formal reasoning. And there was difficulty when this book was coming out. This is going to be a trade book with Penguin, and it's not easy to hide all that massive stuff in that, but I hope that it's been kind of inoculated out in starred chapters as we sort of separated out. But the nature of public, and I'll discuss this tonight about India and how, I mean, suddenly the Prime Minister decided, and the Prime Minister had 31% votes, but got 55% of the seats, because India, as a former colony, follows the British system of first past the post, and we don't distinguish between plurality and majority. And getting more votes than others in a very fractured election can produce huge majorities in the parliament for you, with very small minority among the voters. It's like what happened to Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump didn't get a majority in the nomination elections of the Republican Party in the first 17 of the elections. And indeed, there's evidence. There's a paper that Eric Maskin and I wrote in the New York Review, and earlier a short letter to the New York Times, where we discussed that 2 or 3 of these other candidates could have, in a head-to-head contest, would have defeated Trump, and Trump could have ended up his career as a possible Republican nominee a long time earlier. The point isn't to keep Trump out, which is a kind of passion that seems to have seized the United States right now, but the point is to say how we could get a better representation of people. And there are 2 issues here. One, how to have informed public discussion, the connection between epistemology and politics and ethics on one side, and the other to have a counting system that distinguishes between plurality and majority. And sometimes the confounding of it is strong. This is not the problem of Brexit. The Brexit was a majority, and that was a majority, of course, on the basis of very ill-informed discussion and calling for further discussion, which somehow hasn't, it's not clear that it ever will now, because we are still going in different forms of what would be the best way of getting out, if we are to getting out, and we are. But there is also this institutional side, which applies in other things, and for example, it applies in France. The possibility of Marine Le Pen being elected had worried many people, as her father being elected, possibly president, worried others. And what happens is the other candidate, one of them withdraws, or all of them other than one withdraw, so that then there is a straight fight, and then of course the right-wing extremist party loses. But why should it be necessary? Why should it be necessary for others to get away, as Kenneth Arrow would have put it, in comparing, say, Jospin or Chirac with Le Pen? Why should irrelevant alternatives, present or absent, make a difference? And that's because we don't follow majority rule. I mean, consider this, and this is where the blackboard would have come in. Consider a situation, you have to think. Situation when there are 3 candidates. I could have called them Fillon and Valls, but I'll call them socialist and conservative. So there's a socialist, there's a conservative, and there is Marine Le Pen. And imagine that Marine Le Pen gets 40% first preference, and they prefer Marine Le Pen, followed by the conservatives, followed by the socialists. Or the other way, but Marine Le Pen on top. That's the main point. And then there is a division, let's imagine 30-30. Conservative, socialist, Le Pen. Socialist, conservative, Le Pen. Now the French method is one of them should drop out. But suppose you didn't. Suppose you followed Marquis de Condorcet and say just rank the 3 candidates. And then ask, is there, not his term, what Canaro called and we call, is there a Condorcet winner, namely an alternative which can defeat all the other alternatives. And that would be unaffected by people dropping out, because in the thing that I have described, and had there been blackboard, it would have been easier to see, it's quite clear that both the conservative candidate and the socialist candidate would have defeated Marine Le Pen, because there would have been conservative socialist Le Pen, socialist conservative Le Pen, and if you're making pairwise comparison, Le Pen loses anyway. You don't have to drop them out. On top of that, the conservative and the socialist could fight it out as to which one would be better alternative to Le Pen. Now that would be straightforward majority rule, and if France followed that, it won't, because that's not their rule, then we would have had a better representation of people's preferences. The same point applies, by the way, about Republican nomination, and could indeed, as Eric Maskin and I show, could have been easily applied to the US election. And there could be unexpected results, and one of the plausible. Eric and I wondered whether they are really plausible or not, but it's possible. We took an example where there's strong support for Trump, there's strong support for Hillary Clinton, and there's very weak first preference of, say, 15% for another candidate like, these are not real numbers, like Sanders or Bloomberg. And it's quite easy to show that even with 15% first preference, Bloomberg may be the majority winner, defeating every other candidate. What happens is that the plurality rule just hides the fact of all the information other than your first preference. The guy who got the most first preference could also get the most last preference. And that's knocked out. And that is not untrue even for, say, the Hindutva parties in India, which didn't get a majority. It didn't get a majority of Hindus either. Majority, it got a minority, but a plurality of seats of the peculiarity of our counting system and the peculiarity that is taken from the British system. The French system has similar problems, and you can go around the world. So what we need are both institutional reform on one side to have majority rule, as well as the formation of public opinion, the use of public reasoning coming out, and so that the government by discussion really means having issues visited and revisited and looked at before a decision is taken. I mean, one of the things, of course, in Brexit was that there wasn't a proposition against which one was voting or in favor. For example, what Theresa May outlined yesterday, even though incomplete, is more complete than what was known in whatever it was, 23rd of June or what. And even that was not available. So that it couldn't be said that what she was saying is sanctioned by the people. Britain wants it. Britain wants it is quite a big statement, and that can happen only when the conditions for it is met. Now, I don't want to go on with the ideas. One of the ones that I play quite a bit on is allowing incomplete ordering, because for most decisions we don't need it, and for some decisions allowing incomplete ordering allows us to go ahead. For example, in dealing with what to do about global warming and the climatic challenges in the world, to look for a complete ordering would be a complete mistake. On the other hand, agreeing on certain minimal principles that people would put on top, you could get an agreement, and that requires a mathematical distinction between the maximal and the optimal, a distinction which is not an ad hoc one, which is very central to set theory, as anyone reading, say, Bourbaki's set theory or topology would see. Basically, a maximal alternative is one to which there is no better alternative. An optimal alternative is one which is better than, or at least as good as, every other alternative. Often the optimal wouldn't exist, but the maximal would, and could be a very good thing to do. And one of the easiest illustration is that of the philosophically famous donkey called Buridan's ass. I don't think Buridan owned it, he wrote about it. And this was an ass who couldn't decide which of the two haystacks were better while he was hungry. And since it couldn't decide which one, he went on dithering and died of hunger. Now, neither of the haystacks is the optimal alternative, because he couldn't say that it's at least as good as the other. But both of them are maximal, because he didn't know of any alternative which is better than that. And a less asinine donkey would probably chosen one of these two haystacks rather than starving to death, because clearly that's the worst of the three alternatives. Now that kind of problem arises again and again in public reasoning, especially arriving at compromises. And the book gives much concern with that kind of issue. I think I must stop here, because I tried to give some ideas that tried to engage me in the book, and let's have the discussion. Thank you. I ought to tell you that I look usually at the end of a lecture that I'm in death's door, because my legs lock up, and it looks, people immediately come up with oxygen bottles and so on. But the blood would start flowing presently.
Thank you so much, Amartya.